Okay, welcome to the section 2 video of Econ. So I'm going to be going over the different concepts in Econ and we will be discussing that. So we're going to go ahead and start with our discussion of microeconomics as a whole and understanding how supply and demand interact. So we see that as earlier discussed in section 1, which you should have mastered by now anyways, because we've gone over a lot of it already. We see that with a supermarket, there's a lot of different coordination that has to happen. But what provides the mechanism for this coordination? Well, that's going to be the interaction of supply and demand in markets. So buyers and sellers are going to determine the price for any product or service that is being sold. And so, usually, at least in economics, we can see that buyers and sellers will usually be pretty predictable when it comes to market prices. And so we must first, in order to understand supply and demand, understand, well, what does it mean for there to be something called a perfectly competitive market? And so we're going to start this section by talking about, well, what's a perfectly competitive market and what do we mean by a market? And then getting into self-interested choices. So, how do individuals make decisions? And then we're going to talk about assumptions being somewhat unrealistic, but they're very important for economic analysis. And so, it could be kind of true for uh, situations, but it's usually just used as a benchmark to compare for other more complicated models used in economics. So then after perfect competition, we're going to start talking about taxation and governmental policies, as well as costs and benefits of trade. So how does trade interact in a broader economy as a whole? Then we're going to start to look at how markets fail as well. So fail in a way, and this is a lot going to be due to externalities. Then finally, we get to talk about the role of government and forms of collective choice. So let's get started with perfectly competitive markets. So what is a market? Well, it's comprised of all the buyers and the sellers of a particular good or service. And so this could include the New York Stock Exchange or Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Both are very highly organized. And so usually in these types of markets, lots of buyers and sellers are all put in one location and an auctioneer sets the price. And so normally, however, this is not the case. Normally, markets are actually a lot less formal. They aren't all organized into one area. We can actually think about, okay, buyers and sellers interacting is what makes up a market. It's not just everyone coming into one place. It's not just a supermarket. It's buyers and sellers coming even less formally to just interact in general. So, for example, let's think about the market for gasoline. The sellers are all the local gas stations, and then the buyers are the vehicle owners who go through those gas stations. And so the sellers give the prices, and they will tell the buyers, hey, here's the price for the gas. And then the buyers will choose, hey, where am I gonna go and buy gas from based on the price. And so we are assuming here that people are rational and they will make rational decisions and they will go with the choice that will best benefit them. So they'll go with the lowest gas price and for convenience. So they'll choose it based on price and convenience. And usually for buyers of gasoline, they're well informed about the price. And they also, because the prices are usually posted right on the different stations. Now, gasoline is an example of a highly competitive market. It's a lot of buyers and sellers for even in a small community. And so, if one person uh, is making a decision for gas, it's not going to affect the whole of the market of gas as a whole. That's partially what makes it highly competitive, is there are many buyers and sellers, so the decision of one buyer or one seller won't make the difference for all of them. But it's instead all the buyers and all the sellers in that market, which will really influence the price of gasoline or even the quantity sold. So those are the two main factors we're looking at that are being influenced by that demand and supply. We're looking at if there's a lot of buyers and not one individual buyer or seller will influence the gas prices, then it's highly competitive. Now, all these gas stations knows that there are other stations. So if one owner raises a price, the buyers can just go over to another gas station and choose that price. But if owners lower the price significantly without affecting the number of buyers very much that are going to buy their gas, then they may just be reducing their income. So we're gonna get to figure one very soon. But first, we're going to talk about how if each buyer purchases only a small amount of gasoline compared to the total market, no one buyer can influence the price. So yes, so if each buyer, if there's a lot of them, are only buying a little bit of gas compared to everyone who's buying gas. So think about like the thousands upon thousands of people who are buying gas in our community at a time. Well, just one person buying gas isn't going to make a very much difference on the price. And so we say now that competitive, a perfectly competitive market has a good or service that's highly standardized and the number of buyers and sellers is large. So, and participants are well informed about the price. So, buyers and sellers know what they're going to buy or sell without influencing the price. So, like for individuals, that is. So, the three factors for it being perfectly competitive. It's highly standardized, so it's mostly the same across what's being sold for all of them. It is a lot of buyers and sellers, and all the participants are well informed about the market price. So they, the buyers and sellers themselves, they can then, what it means for them to have many buyers and sellers, it means that they aren't going to influence the market price very much. Now, very few markets like this actually exist. But many real world markets have a high degree of competition and thus can be described in terms of the perfect competition assumption. And so the market for gas is actually a very good example of this, of a nearly perfectly competitive market. Now, if you live in a small town, this may be different because there's not so many buyers and sellers. But if you don't live in a very small town, then you'll probably notice gas prices don't really are somewhat different at different stations. So gas prices will be changed among station to station, but those differences are not large at all. And thus, we can apply, because the between each of the different sellers is quite large, we can see that we can apply the principles of perfectly competitive markets whilst it not being a perfectly competitive market itself. And then we can also use it as a benchmark to compare the outcomes of other types of markets. So next up, we get to talk about demand. So what is the quantity demanded? Well, it's the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. And so We can see here, if I go ahead and underline this, good amount that good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Willing and able. And so what does this depend on? Well, one of the most important is the goods price here. So if it's higher, then buyers will demand less good. If it's lower, then it'll demand more. So this negative relationship is called the law of demand right here. So law of demand. If a price goes up, people will demand it less. And on the other hand, if the price goes down, then people will demand it more. And so you're getting this law of demand. Get that very clearly in your head so you're ready for the types of questions you may be asked. Now, what is the law of demand a result of? Well, it happens because of the cost benefit analysis that rational decision makers, so we're assuming that people are rational, right? And so if someone is rational, then they will do cost benefit analysis when deciding how am I going to put my resources towards certain things. And so, if they see that a price of good increases, then the opportunity cost, remember what an opportunity cost is, it's the cost of the option or the next best option that you could have chosen, or the benefits that you would get from the next best option to the one you choose. So the opportunity cost is going up as the price goes up. And and thus consumers this is because consumers have to choose, okay, I'm not going to consume this other good. So let's say for example, the price of apples and oranges. Okay. So we have apples here and oranges and they're at the same price. But as the price for apples increases, we have an opportunity cost of an orange that is becoming greater because if you buy the apple, then you're missing out on that orange that's both cheaper and you can eat it just the same as an apple you would. So keep that in mind when thinking about what happens when price increases. So the example they give is that if gasoline rises, then people may find ways to reduce the amount they drive. So because they could be spending money on other things, they'll choose, oh, I'm not going to drive as much because my opportunity cost is too high for me to be willing to buy gas as much. And so they can do this by planning trips more carefully or choosing to ride the bus, so forth, ways that you avoid driving. Then we get to see in the table in figure one, we get to see what's known as a demand schedule here. So a demand schedule is the purchases of an individual based on the price. And so if we go ahead and take a look at figure one now, we can see that we have a demand schedule here. So we have the price, we demand 52 gallons. If it's at $1.50, and notice how it's going down as the price goes up. So demand will go down as the price goes up. It's a very key concept here in economics. Then we also get to see in figure one that there's another way of showing Steve's specific demand schedule, and that is the demand curve. So if we go ahead and look back up here at the demand curve, we can see how do we read a demand curve. So let's take this point right here. This point indicates that at a price of $5, Steve is going to be choosing to buy 30 gallons per month. So, as you can see, there is a downward slope of this demand curve. And so if we go ahead and notice, if we were to go and say the price goes down to $3, then our quantity demanded will increase to 40 because it's cheaper. And therefore, Steve will want to consume more gas. Okay, so if we go ahead then and look at what is happening on the demand curve, we can see that as this price changes, then the quantity changes as well. And so it's very important to understand that this is not changing demand and sup or we aren't getting to supply yet, but this isn't changing demand itself. The price does not influence the demand. The price influences the quantity demanded. So there's a very important distinction here in wording that may even be tested. So if a price drops, then the quantity demanded will increase. Whereas if the price increases, the quantity demanded will decrease. And so you're left here with a problem where you may be asked, say the price of gasoline decreases from $5 to $3. What is the result in the competitive market for gasoline? And the answer choices may be A, demand increases, B, demand decreases, C, quantity demanded increases, and D, quantity demand decreases. So if we're decreasing price, then that means we are going to increase the quantity demanded and not the demand itself, because it's a very important distinction. Now, if we want to look at not just Steve as a whole, but for the entire market, we have to add up every single consumer at every single price point. So if we look at figure 2 above, this is what happens when we combine two different demand schedules. So if we have the price and the quantities for each price for both Steve and Nora here, we can create a market here if it's just between Steve and Nora. And for the price of gasoline here, we can see that it actually changes. And so we have this demand curve for the entire market. And so we see that it sums up the different prices. Now, we add one question that they may ask if they don't show pictures or a graph. They may ask, what does it look like to add two demand curves? And the answer will be they will be added horizontally on the graph. So sometimes econ questions require you to imagine the different markets in your head, and this is very important. So as we can see, with each of these demand curves here, we're adding this value of just about, so price of gasoline. I'm gonna real quick scroll up here. So we see that at the price of $6, right? Nora is at 2 demanded, so we have 2. And then Steve is at 25. So we add these and we get 27. Notice how they're added horizontally. They aren't added vertically. So we don't go from here and then get up some point like way up here. That's not how they are added. They are added horizontally. Okay, so next up, we can talk about shifts in the demand curve. Now, when it comes to demand curve, we can actually start talking about demand itself and not just the quantity demanded. So we know that a demand curve shows the relationship between the quantity demanded and the price. If we assume that all the other factors that influence the quantity demanded all are unchanged. But what if those different factors do change? And so that's what we're going to be investigating in this shifts in the demand curve. Lots of things can influence quantity demanded, but what if the entire demand curve is shifting? What if all of the possible price points and all of the possible quantities demanded can shift? So, for instance, if we have the quantity of gasoline demanded declining at every price, we can see that a market demand curve will shift left. So if we go down here to figure 3, we will have a decrease in demand, which means for you guys, it's going to look like this. And we go this way and we shift this way. And so we're decreasing that demand here. If we have things like it says easier to make bicycle lanes, well, then we're going to have less demand overall for gas for all the consumers because, well, it's easier to not use gas now. So here are the few factors. Now, before we actually get in depth of the factors, we're going to go ahead and list them. Those factors are income, the price of related goods, tastes, expectations, and the number of buyers. So each of these different sections or these different factors will influence the entire demand curve as a whole. So, to begin, we're going to be talking about income. So, if someone has less money due to less income, they're going to have less money to spend on the things they buy. And so, this will likely reduce the consumption of gasoline. And so, you, in this case, demand is positively related to income, which means when income rises, then the demand as a whole, the entire demand curve, starting here, is going to shift. Oh, wait, other way, shift to the right. And if income falls, the quantity demanded falls. Um, Now, for goods that this is true, this is called normal goods. So normal goods are what are these goods. If your income increases, then the quantity demanded rises, but if your income falls, then the quantity demanded will fall. And so not all goods act this way, though. So there are things called inferior goods, which bus rides are a good example of an inferior good. So if income increases, then you're going to use a car more likely than a bus. And so demand for bus will go down if your income increases. Then we have the prices of related goods impacting the overall demand. And so the price of an airline ticket falling means that the demand will increase because people will be more willing to do airline travel. But people are willing also to substitute their travel in the air for that of a car. And so they could also substitute a car driving for an airline instead. And thus, they'll reduce the number of miles they drive, and so they'll demand less gasoline. And so, if a decline in one good reduces the causes a reduction in the quantity demanded of the other, we say they're substitutes. So I feel like a better example of this than planes and cars, which is kind of a weird comparison, I would say would probably be something more along the lines of um, bread and tortillas. So if you have like a loaf of bread, right, and the price increases, then the people buying bread are going to likely shift over to buy tortillas instead. And so the price of one good is impacting the price of another good. The price of bread is impacting the quantity demanded of tortillas. And so this would be a good example of a substitute. However, let's say price of an automobile insurance falls. So with lower insurance costs, people are willing to buy automobiles and it's easier to afford them now because you can get insurance easier. So you need insurance for a car. So if the price for insurance decreases, then the car ownership uh, demand will increase. And so this is what is known as a complement. So another good example of this would be like peanut butter and jelly. If the price of peanut butter goes down, then you're more likely to buy jelly that goes along with it. If you buy more peanut butter, you're buying more jelly. And so let's even say the price of peanut butter goes up, then you're going to be buying less jelly because you're going to be using less jelly on those sandwiches because you aren't going to be using as much peanut butter. Unless you're a crazy person and decide to just eat sandwiches with just jelly in them, which, why are you even watching this video? Like, anyways, tastes is the next thing that can impact the demand for a good. And this is once again important for comparing benefits of consumption and opportunity costs. So if someone perceives the good as being better and their taste tells them, "Oh, I really, really love peanut butter." Well, then obviously their demand is going to increase for that good because they like peanut butter more, so they're going to eat it more. I mean, I'm a big peanut butter eater, and I can say this about myself. It's a problem, really. It's an addiction to peanut butter. So, if you have a better taste, then you will want to buy that more. Now, they use the example of pollution. So if you perceive buying gasoline as bad for the environment, and if you perceive the environmental impacts here, then you're going to be more concerned with pollution and thus buy less gasoline. And so the demand will decrease. Then we have expectations. So if you're afraid that you're going to lose your job, then you may cut back in driving in the present so that we can anticipate those future changes in which you may have problems with your income. And so this is the expectations of the future. If you are expecting that you are no longer gonna like peanut butter in the future, then you may stop buying it now just to save yourself some money. Then you have number of buyers. So if you have more consumers, then the demand will increase. And so if the community is growing, then and there's more people and more businesses coming into the town, then the market demand for gasoline will increase with a growing population. So you have more demand with more people.